All right, so we're going to start our next unit of study, which is all about a study of the novel Life of Pi by Yann Martel. So this novel is kind of divided into three parts, and we'll talk about sort of the different sections of the book. But just so you know, when you get reading, make sure you read the author's note at the very beginning of the book, because this is sort of integral to understanding the whole kind of setup of the novel as a whole. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit, a general discussion of the novel before we get into some of the details and quotations and important aspects of the book. So let's look at an overview of the novel before we dive right in. So our protagonist in the novel is Pi. His full name, if you've read part one, is Piscine Molitor Patel. And he's got an unusual name, and it's sort of related to some of his sort of characteristics. But he is a boy, an Indian boy from Pondicherry, India. And we see sort of his progression, his development from a child to a grown man over the course of this sort of miraculous events that have happened to him in his childhood and adolescence. So he's our main character, and he's the one whose story is told to our author. So he is the one who survived 227 days on a life raft with wild animals. The origins of his name are kind of interesting. He's named after a swimming pool, Piscine Molitor. The word piscine means swimming pool in French. He changes his name, so he was harassed as a young boy. They started calling him Pissing, sort of saying his name in a rude way. He couldn't handle it, so he changed his name, shortened his name to Pi, and that becomes his sort of chosen name, nickname. And as you know, any of you math majors, pi is a very important number in terms of understanding the world, and mathematical equations rely on this number that really doesn't have an end. It's often shortened to 3.14, but if you calculate the circumference of a circle, it actually has so many numbers after the decimal point that it is completely sort of unfathomable, a number so irrational that we can't fully comprehend it. So it's an important number, but it's one that we sort of defies our human minds. We can't adequately sort of understand the full capacity of the number pi, but it's very functional in terms of calculating circumferences and the circular dimensions of things. So why does that relate to our character? Well, the theme of things, ideas, abstractions that kind of defy human consciousness, that's sort of part of a thematic thread that ties together some of the ideas of the novel. So there are certain things in our human existence that are unexplainable, that are beyond our rational minds. We can't comprehend them. Um, the number 3.14 is one of these numbers that does that, but there are other things, miraculous things that happen we can't explain, uh, all of these things that might occur in your life that are just beyond your rational mind. So uh, Yann Martel is going to sort of bring in some of these little magical or irrational ideas to kind of challenge our rational minds and force us to sort of make a leap into believing some things that are seemingly unbelievable on the surface. So, speaking of sort of miraculous ideas and spiritual things that we can't see, but that we often believe in regardless, This is where we get a sort of tie into the spirituality or religion that's present in the novel. So we start off with the promise that Pie's story is one that will make you believe in God once you hear it. Whether or not it sort of follows through on that is sort of up to you as readers, but that's the sort of promise that the narrative makes. So if you read the author's note, there is a kind of setup of Pie's narrative where it's regarded as a story that will make whoever hears it believe in God. And our author, Yann Martel, sort of is setting us up for a story that's very spiritually based. So it does address sort of many different religions, Hinduism, Christianity, and Islam. Pi has all three, so he celebrates, is a follower of all three, so very unconventional in that regard. And there are sort of some ties between religious belief and storytelling in general. So both are kind of, if you think of, what the basis of religion is, it's usually a bunch of sacred texts, stories that explain the creation of the world, that tell you stories about people who are important, who are life-changing, who are influential and have impacted the world and society. So storytelling is sort of at the root of religion. There are sacred texts, the Quran, the Torah, the Bible. So these are sort of the texts that bring together all of these sacred stories. So storytelling is very integral to religious belief, and Pie's story is sort of fits along with some of those other miraculously, spiritual stories. Um, and it's intended to sort of make you suspend your belief system to enough that you would uh, contemplate something miraculous, something even divine in existence. So it's something to keep in mind. So when you're reading, uh, how you sort of read the story and how it sort of picks up on spirituality and develops those themes as well will become an important part of it, especially when you get to the end. And this idea of whether um, Martel will also kind of force us to think about what is reality. And often we sort of perceive reality as there being one true reality, one believable, rational explanation for things, and everything else is either a fantasy or, uh, an imaginary situation, a lie. So we perceive of reality as truth, um, and he sort of forces us to question reality as just a story, one of many stories that could be told about what happens. So there is this idea that, if all reality is like a story, then why wouldn't you not pick a better story? So if you think about how subjective our own realities are, if you think about even, last weekend what you guys did, maybe you have a version of events that differs from the person you spent time with. So I have a version of events of what my boyfriend and I did this weekend. He might have a different version of that story. And maybe the person who, our neighbor, would have a different version of what they observed us doing. So there's all these sort of different versions or perceptions of what happens, and a lot of it is subjective. So that theme or idea of reality as a kind of fictional construct will also be present throughout the narrative. So what does storytelling have to do with religion? We kind of said they both are based off of this idea of miraculous events. So miraculous things happen in religious stories. Miraculous things will happen to Pi. So there are sort of these ties between storytelling and religious belief that Martel is sort of forcing us to look at. And the major connection is sort of this idea that both a story and religious belief can sort of make us believe in things, miraculous things that we can't explain. So it's sort of having faith in irrational events, magical things, miraculous things that we can't explain with our, five senses. We can't see it or prove that it exists, but our faith is there, so we believe it anyway. So that's sort of our main sort of tying things together is to have faith. So something, if you have faith in it, you believe in it regardless of whether or not you can prove it exists. So I have faith that, I am going to wake up the next morning, that I'll make it through the night. If I didn't have faith that I would wake up, I probably wouldn't fall asleep. So you have faith in all things, not just in religion, but you have faith in your relationship. If you love somebody, you have to make this kind of leap of faith that they love you too, right? So you can't prove it, you just sort of believe in it. So there are things beyond religion, love, health, life itself, all these things that we invest our faith into, even though we can't necessarily prove they exist. We still every day make those leaps of faith and believe in things that we cannot see or prove. So Pye's narrative will have these kind of miraculous events that really stretch our imagination, and it asks us as readers to sort of believe in the unbelievable, the irrational, the things that we can't explain. So there'll be events like his crazy landing on this crazy island, that, defies our sense of science or reason. There'll also be sort of weird events that we can't explain, things that seem beyond us. But the story asks you as readers to sort of make that leap of faith and follow Pye's story, as if it was, a true story, because this is his true story, his truth of what happened. So the events of the novel also deal with issues related to trauma, tragedy, and suffering. We'll talk more about this, but you can characterize this novel, the genre, as a kind of Bildungsroman. But we'll talk a little bit more about that. But that is a novel of development, where the character sort of grows and experiences maybe a loss of innocence over the course of the events, moving from a very sort of childish perception of reality to a more mature adult kind of sense of self. So that Bildungsroman, the development of Pye's character, will transform over the course of the events that play out. And there will be a kind of loss of innocence, as he learns about the reality of the world and sort of learns about himself and undergoes kind of tragic events in the process of growing up. But if you think about how people cope with trauma and tragedy, we've sort of seen some examples earlier in texts that we've read already. But part of that healing process or coping with difficult like life events, there is a role for storytelling, in terms of healing or coping from something tragic. There is this kind of need to tell one story or to work through those traumatic events, make sense of them. That's sort of like talk therapy, right? You talk about the past and hopefully maybe be able to sort of understand it and transform it from something that's a random bunch of, traumatic events to something that makes more sense to you and you understand it now. So talking about trauma and telling one's story is sort of an important step as well in overcoming some traumatic events. The role of religion in coping with trauma is also part of understanding the greater picture, I guess, to small traumas that might happen to us over a course of our life. So it could also help us make sense of